Thanks so much for joining us. Today's conversation is centered on a challenge that many fraud, product, and security teams are actively facing. And that's as privacy protections strengthen, visibility into user behavior and risk is getting harder to maintain. Privacy-first technologies and evolving regulations are doing important work for our consumers, but they're also changing how teams are detecting fraud, how they're identifying returning users, and how they're assessing risk across sessions. So over the next hour, you'll hear from leaders who are addressing this reality in practice. We'll hear them talk a little bit about the trade-offs their teams might be making, some common misconceptions around privacy compliance, and what a privacy-aligned approach to persistent identification actually looks like today. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. If you have questions at any point, drop them in the Q&A box below. We'll leave time at the end of today's session to get to as many questions as we can. Today's webinar is also being recorded, and you'll receive a copy at the end of today's session. And lastly, if you'd like to enable closed captioning, you can do so at any time using the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. Alrighty, let's get started. So I'm excited to introduce our host for today's session, Catherine Wonas, VP of Product at Fingerprint. She's awesome. A little bit about Catherine. She currently leads the strategy and development behind Fingerprint's device intelligence, which helps companies maintain visibility across the user journey while respecting user privacy and regulatory requirements. Catherine brings more than 25 years experience across product marketing and product management, and she's helped guide multiple B2B SaaS companies from early stage through to acquisition. So Catherine, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be joined today by several great panelists. We have Pratik Mehta, Group Product Manager at Tremendous, Dmitry Emiliev, founder at Fraudbusters, and David Montague, CEO at MyNet Watchman. I'll go around and let each of you introduce yourself. We will start off with Pratik.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks for having me. I'm Pratik. I work at Tremendous, which is a B2B payout solution. Clients use us for a wide variety of use cases. We deal with fraud in a number of different contexts and have been using Fingerprint for a long time. And I've also leveraged Fingerprint in my prior roles. Been in fintech for about a decade, so I've seen fraud evolve a lot, as we all have.
Excellent, excellent. David?
Hi, my name is David, and I'm the CEO for MyNet Watchman. MyNet Watchman focuses on identifying synthetic and compromised accounts, whether that's compromised credentials, compromised emails, and/or compromised credit cards. I come from a tech background, worked at Amazon, Google, Expedia, and the likes in cybersecurity, payments, and the fraud prevention world.
Thank you so much. And now we've got Dmitry.
Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. I'm a founder of Fraudbusters fraud consulting company. I'm a strategic fraud prevention leader with over 10 years of experience of building end-to-end functions in banking, fintechs, and big tech. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you all here. I'm very excited that we've got a group of folks that sort of spans the gamut between practitioners, advisors, and so forth. So one of the interesting things is just how intricately networked the world of fraud and privacy really are. I was recently at the Gartner IAM Summit, and one of their analysts, Bernard Wu, said that looking at the privacy landscape in 2025 is a lot like looking at the world of music. So you have composers with a vision who are writing a piece of music with a specific set of instruments and arrangements in mind. But then there are bands and arrangers who might have to adapt the original piece in order to fit particular instruments or particular performers. The composers in this case, in the privacy world, are the regulators and legislative bodies. They're setting these privacy rules in place based on what they feel to be the best protections for their citizens, for the inhabitants of their countries. But then there are industry professionals like those that we have on this webinar, CISOs, CIOs, engineers, product managers, fraud investigators. You're the ones that have to figure out how to adapt and interpret the regulations and policies so that they best fit your needs, the needs at hand, while still being faithful to the original spirit of the song, still maintaining privacy for those who deserve to have it, while being able to unmask the fraudsters who really should have no right to privacy at all. This is the challenge that we're talking about today. Before we get started, my panelists and I would actually like to know a little bit more about your challenges. So I'm going to launch a poll here. And we'd like to know what your top priority for 2026 is when it comes to fraud and privacy. Are you looking to regain visibility without adding friction, to improve pre-login risk assessment? Are you concerned about reducing false positives in terms of fraud detection? How are you looking to modernize your detection infrastructure in the light of AI agents more commonly starting to visit your sites in charge of doing things? Or are you concerned about aligning teams around a shared strategy? There should be a poll piece in there, and so we'll be able to start to gather those. And I do see some responses coming in. I know this can be a really difficult thing to choose from. I know that I've heard a lot of folks that are concerned about all of them, but definitely interested in knowing what your biggest challenge is as you're heading into the new year. All right, so looks like we have quite a few folks in here. And so we're going to go ahead and end it and share the results here. So it looks as if really the top priorities are around modernizing detection infrastructure in the light of AI agents. What level of privacy do AI agents have the right to expect? How can we adapt privacy and identity regulations in the light of AI agents that are acting on behalf of specific people? How can we pass that identity information on to additional folks and so forth? Close following on that is aligning teams around a shared strategy. We have a lot of different titles on the webinar today, and so being able to make sure that all of these people are singing from the same hymnal can indeed be a pretty big challenge. And of course, there is always the challenge of reducing false positives in your fraud detection piece as well. So happy to see that we've got quite a few different things in there that we're talking about. So that then launches into discussing a little bit about that. A lot of folks, as I said, are really concerned about AI and how AI is completely reshaping the fraud landscape. It's giving attackers new ways to scale, automate, and adapt in ways we've never seen before. I think, David, you mentioned one of the things that you guys are looking for is the synthetic identities and things like that. And there are certainly other ways that AI can be used to enable fraudsters to scale their efforts. At the same time, governments around the world are constantly trying to figure out how to adapt privacy regulations to the new realities. Also, legitimate users are becoming more privacy aware. So, for example, many ordinary folks are now using things like incognito mode and VPNs. These used to be the exclusive calling card of fraudsters. In fact, one survey that I saw recently showed that roughly 1.75 billion people worldwide are now estimated to use a VPN. That's around 1/3 of all internet users globally. And yet I still see people that are in the fraud industry that are blocking people that are using VPNs in a blanket way, even though they're not using the VPNs to do things like circumvent geographic restrictions. They're just using it as a way to enhance their privacy. So this increase in privacy awareness is great. I use a VPN often myself, but it's also making it harder for organizations to confidently tell the difference between a legitimate user and a potential bad actor. On average, organizations say that because of all of this privacy that folks are starting to build in, they can only reliably recognize about half of the devices visiting their site or app before the user logs in. So this can make it really hard to detect things like account takeovers. So many times with account takeovers, what a group might be looking for is, have I seen this device before that's associated with this account? So if I haven't, then maybe I might want to issue a challenge. Whereas if I have, perhaps I can go ahead and just use that as a possession factor. So in account takeovers where someone has the right username and password, but may not actually be the user in question, being able to recognize that device can be really important. They might also be having a lot of trouble detecting multi-accounting, which is where someone is pretending to be multiple users all from the same device in an attempt to take advantage of referral bonuses, new user signups, get around paywalls, and so forth. Over 3/4 of respondents in a recent survey that we did reported that privacy-first technologies are severely or moderately impacting their fraud detection capabilities. So teams are trying to keep up with all of these rapidly evolving threats while also navigating privacy requirements that are becoming more complex. And then when you look at the privacy requirements differing from region to region, how those are changing. So for example, I know GDPR, they're trying to figure out how to best adapt that to the new reality and make it less onerous. About 90% of respondents say that their organization is looking at how they can adopt more persistent privacy compliant visitor identification methods in the coming year. So, given all of this information, my first question to our panelists is, in your experience, what's the biggest misconception that companies have these days about privacy regulations like GDPR when it comes to fraud detection? I'll throw it over to you first, Dimitri.
Yes, thank you. First of all, it was a good metaphor about artists producing different kind of regulations and its adoption on the businesses side. So, in my experience, the biggest misconception is that privacy is does equal prohibition of usage of different security tools. This is absolutely wrong. How I see it, is that regulations is the segregation of intentions of usage of different kind of technologies. Let me elaborate on that. So everyone uses search engines, and everyone faces different types of internet ads. I believe everyone installed at least one application, and there is a tick which you could choose whether to track or not. And this is just one example of tracking, which is legitimate because it has purpose. If any other kind of technology like fingerprinting has a very lawful security intent, and if the business is explicit about that intention, that is absolutely okay to continue using it. But the main point here is that fraud prevention doesn't equal just fingerprint. It could utilize the set of signals starting from devices, its environment, network signals, and ending with behavior on your own resources. And that kind of information, no one could stop you from using it on your side. So I believe that's the main point that raises different concerns in different businesses.
Interesting. Yeah. So definitely that, misconception that privacy is prohibiting you from using specific types of tools. The concept of fair use, right? Which is, I don't particularly want you following me around the web, seeing what I'm buying, what I'm looking at, and so forth. But if someone's trying to attack me, I'd love it if you'd be able to step in and see those sorts of signs. David?
I think that, the biggest thing I would add to that is just that, understanding that you need to meet these different requirements when it comes to compliance shouldn't basically come at the cost of fraud prevention and or the user experience. And so you really need to understand what the intent is, make sure that you're really working with your legal department to make sure that you don't take an approach that essentially takes you to a disadvantage when it comes to fraud prevention because you're not making use of information in a way that you should. I think as a lot of these regulations come out and you look at how people implement them, you can sometimes get a little too draconian in terms of how you're going to implement that and not make use of good signal. And fraudsters understand limitations, so they understand. I can tell you to remove things, add things, change things, and they're going to take advantage of it. And you need to make sure that you're aware of that.
Pratik, anything to add there?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is I think even PII can, be used for fraud prevention, that's a legitimate purpose. And I think the misconceptions I see is mostly around like what signals can you use, and blanket collection of PI is kind of forbidden under GDPR. But a lot of the different privacy regulations do have carve-outs for um, using those signals for legitimate purposes, and fraud is one of them. And so I think making sure that there is like you're able to demonstrate the purpose clearly and why you're collecting certain pieces of information that might be sensitive, limiting the use case of those fields and data points to the use cases that you've outlined. I think that's where I see a lot of like the misconceptions, and you have to kind of work, and this is where working with your legal team on understanding sort of what kind of consent you need to capture, what kind of disclosures you need to have, whether your data processor or data or not, kind of also impact maybe how you'd go about collecting those pieces of information.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned collecting consent. That's one of the things that I often joke here around is sometimes it can be difficult to collect consent from the fraudster to say, hey, let's go ahead and let me detect your fraud. But it's also obviously really impacted not only fraud detection efforts, but also user experience and so forth. We've all experienced those great little pop-ups at the bottom of the browser that says, which cookies are you going to allow me to use? To the point where everybody just sort of mindlessly clicks. And I know that the GDPR folks are looking into whether or not this sort of almost unintended consequence of everything, where now every website requires extra clicks, is worth the additional knowledge that people can gain. It kind of leads me to the next question, which is, um, as privacy regulations continue to tighten, browsers have started to remove many of the signals that fraud teams have relied on for years, in the interest of preventing tracking and things like that as well. So it's always a balance. But I'm interested in knowing how you've seen this shift impact fraud detection in your world over the last 12 to 18 months. David, since you're really looking at some of these signals, I'll kick it off with you.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think the biggest change that you're seeing is now a lot more people look like a first-time user. And now you have to rely more and more on authentication and verification, which means you actually are going to impact the user experience. And it means you're going to be relying more on account level signals like phone and email, and doing other activities like two-factor authentication and MFA. And the reality is, the email can be compromised as well. It can be faked as well. But the unintended consequence is that you actually are trading off, whether you intended to or not, user experience for privacy, which is definitely going to be, I think, the big challenge that we're all going to have to deal with.
Yeah, Dimitri, anything to add?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I will share my experience of working in ads fraud prevention area. This is the area where third-party cookies were essential. And I believe if you are users of highly protected browsers like Safari or Firefox, you have noticed that there are a lot of site trackers which are being blocked during your activity. So that means that the browser cannot communicate with other websites which want to track your activity there. And this is a tendency which started, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago already. And Google Chrome, I believe the last major browser, which is currently working on prohibition of third-party cookies. And for some businesses, which you want to protect, it might be crucial. For example, for e-commerce or for a company which serve a set of different kind of stores, because you want to track your user across several of your own resources to make sure that this is a legitimate user. But simultaneously with that, we see that users themselves are trying to shift mostly to privacy focused browsers like Brave, etc., because they are just taking care about their own security. They don't want to be tracked. Uh, what does it mean for us as a security service? It means that according to different types of assets you're trying to protect, we are able to shift either to first-party resources like our own cookies or our own stable identifiers like fingerprints, in case we got the explicit consent of from our customers. But when we speak about large e-commerces, that means that uh, the usual tools which we were utilizing are not appropriate anymore. And for big players, it got much harder to identify a single user. Catherine mentioned before multi-accounting problem. So it all boils down to our ability to identify a single user using the same device with multiple accounts. But in e-commerce, uh, with the lack of signals, we need to focus more on additional details like maybe TLS level, which is still trackable, to detect the surge of any type of behavior of any newcome users to prevent fraudulent activity on our side.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for us, it's almost been good news because we're specifically in this business because with all of these ever changing, browser changes and things like that, device identity has become a very difficult problem to solve. It takes a lot of research, iteration, knowledge to be able to generate this accurate and persistent device identifier so that you can identify things like multi-accounting fraud and so forth, especially now that cookies and geolocation information are really insufficient in and of themselves for recognizing returning visitors. So I think this is something that's created a lot of opportunities for us, but we certainly see a lot of frustration on the part of our customers and even the fraud platforms in trying to deal with all of this, which is really why we're specialized just in this particular area. Pratik, as a practitioner, I'd love to know how it's affected your fraud detection efforts out in the field.
A lot of our clients use Tremendous for referral payouts, for example, and so being able to identify a user deterministically would is like the perfect kind of outcome. And of course, with folks using, private relays, VPNs, switching privacy web browsers, it's become harder. And so our focus has shifted more towards understanding probabilistic signals. Obviously, device fingerprinting is one of them, but also trying to understand what a user's regular behavior looks like. What's the baseline of a fraudster versus um, sort of a median user, and what is kind of anomalous, and using that as a signal to identify fraud. And even that's challenging because oftentimes what you'll see is a fraudster's behavior. For example, someone who might be referring thousands of users might look very similar to your power users and kind of the users you want to protect. Um, and that just requires layering and even more set of data. And so it goes from the world where we were maybe 2, 3, 4 years ago, where you can rely on a couple of deterministic signals to identify fraud, to now using a much wider array of probabilistic signals.
Yeah, I think that's the perfect segue to our next question, which is that as privacy tools go mainstream, we're seeing a lot of changes out there. So, as you mentioned, if you do your analysis, and I definitely recommend analyzing your visitors before you start putting rules in place. If 90% of your visitors are using VPNs or private browsing, you can't just block them. With the rise of AI tools, maybe you're not just going to be able to block every bot that comes to your site if you want to take advantage of some of these different pieces. So we're definitely seeing quite a few changes of that. And again, it's really important to take a look at that profile of your users so that you can figure out how exactly your good users differ from your fraudulent users. And I know that, we've got some tools to help with that. Dimitri, interested in hearing your perspective on that challenge.
Yeah, sure. I would start with VPNs. Probably 5 or 6 years ago, it was an ambiguous sign of someone having bad intention on your website or other kind of resource. Nowadays, it's not true. We can't just block VPN, and here starts the work of the first line of the analysts. There are too much variables in it. We need to answer a question. What kind of VPN it is? Is it a commercial VPN or a malicious VPN? Is this a hosting IP, or this is a residential IP? Is it a corporate IP? And the key outcome here is to understand the final intention of your customer. You mentioned that the share of customers who are using different privacy tools differs from business to business. For recent year, I've never seen value lower than, let's say, 10% to round it. And 10%, this is a significant amount of customers, and we can't just filter them out. So this is the point. There we need to dive deeper into additional signals to gather them from device, network, and behavior, because just the sign that this is a VPN doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, anything to add, David?
Yeah, this is this is a really interesting subject, and I kind of I agree with you completely that you need to really understand your customers and their behaviors and what they do, because there really is a lot of mainstream activity that are using these different services that can make it ambiguous. So VPN makes it ambiguous where this person's coming from or how they're getting to you as one of the signals. But you also have ways that you can make your email ambiguous. People use proxy emails and alias emails, and they do it because they don't want you to have their email, not because they're a fraudster. So you got to really make sure you're balancing this and you understand kind of the behavior of your customer base. And that's part of when we talk about email reputation. We're looking to see, like, is it disposable? Is it a proxy? Is it an alias? And the reality is they can do it with a phone number. They can do it with a credit card, with one-time use numbers. All of the PII that's being provided essentially could be anonymized. And for you as a company, you need to basically ask yourself two questions. Is one, what is my normal typical customer behavior in using this type of information? How risky is it to me? And then two, can I detect the fact that somebody is using this type of anonymization? so then I can then decide what is it that I want to do now that I know that it is something that is happening.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And one of the things I think you mentioned that's really important is understanding your customers. And that can even surface itself in user experience. So, for example, I recently saw a news broadcast that advocated using a VPN in order to take advantage of regional discounts. It taught you all about how, oh, if you come in and you're trying to rent a car and you say that you're coming in from France, you'll have lower rates than if you are coming in from the United States. And they were just saying this as if it wasn't fraud. It was just a normal, ordinary thing that an educated user would do. And so if you have users that are, say, trying to do this, and you know that maybe there's been these things, then you can't challenge them with a message that basically says, you're a fraudster, we hate you, go away. It's like, no, we know you're a good customer, you're a little uneducated. So you have to be much more nuanced about the message that you pop up when you don't let them do these sorts of things. So there are fraudsters that know what they're doing is wrong, and there are fraudsters that are unintentional fraudsters and just think, oh, this is the new way that an educated consumer does their business. And so really being able to differentiate that and being able to figure out, how do you educate your customer base, how do you treat them nicely but still not let them do things that they shouldn't be doing, is definitely a nuance that's difficult to manage.
I think
Yeah, go
when
ahead.
I was just that there's also a KYC aspect to this as well, that you need to realize, like if I'm a bank and I'm trying to set up a new account for a credit card or a new loan, and somebody's using an email that is a proxy email, I can't authenticate that. I can't actually, from a KYC standpoint, actually say, I know this belongs to David, right? Because there's nowhere you're going to find that exists. And actually, that email could not work in 10 minutes or in 2 days. So there is, there's a positive and negative aspect, and it can change even for your good customers, where you then have to just say, hey, David, I need you to give me another email, because that's not going to allow me to get to the right level of compliance that I need to, finish my KYC process as well, right? So it can cause abuse, it can be fraud, and it can also, hurt in terms of conversion and or, making sure that you can know your user is still your user the next time they come back.
Yeah, very good point. Dimitri, Pratik, anything else to add?
I think for us, it's for context, we offer a payout solution. As part of that, we have a fraud detection tool that our clients are using. And obviously, there's some percentage of fraud that gets escalated to for manual review. And I think there's like interesting implications for us in, well, like behavior data becomes or probabilistic data becomes more important. And how do you surface that in a way that clients can actually use? And if someone's going through a review queue, they surface the right information at the right time in sort of a cohesive manner, because probabilistic data, or just if you just throw data at an individual, it's not helpful for anyone. And so we've seen not only like obviously the product impacts on as the user is going through your product, but also, well, like what does this mean for your internal teams and internal tools? Because ultimately, everything does flow through that as well. And if your internal team doesn't have the um, right tools and right experience to make decisions accurately and correctly and efficiently, ultimately that's going to impact your user experience as well.
Yeah, that's a very good
I
point. Yeah.
I would like to add here that those tools are much more widespread than people think, because the good legitimate example of this is Apple Private Relays, so which generally just proxies the business just can't know the true IP address or even location sometimes of the customer. The same Apple email proxies. So in terms of KYC, It is not also means that you prohibiting to register to pass those checks with proxies, but we have to distinguish which of them are malicious and which of them are legitimate and regular. Good point, David.
Yeah, I think that sort of leads us to our next question, which is really how are these privacy shifts influencing product decisions when you're trying to do it? I think there's been a huge thing recently around age verification to use a lot of different services, social media services, and so forth. I know Australia just put a rule in place where if you're under 16, you can't use social media. All of these things are meant to really protect the most vulnerable among us, but they can be extremely intrusive for people that are just trying to go about their day, right? Folks are really leery of having to register with a government ID just in order to, use their favorite social media site or express their political opinions or anything like that. And so I think as privacy continues to shift and you're looking at age verification, regional things as well. So there are some states in the United States where specific types of services are banned and some states where it's okay. And now it's really a challenge of how do you collect the information without folks running for the hills because they don't want you to collect all of their stuff. So where are you seeing these privacy shifts influencing your product decisions, and where are product trade-offs coming into play when trying to protect users while keeping friction low? Pratik, David, Dimitri?
I think I'll go back to what you kind of example you gave earlier is like if it's a user who's acting fraudulent, but it's not really fraudulent, the terminology that you use becomes much more important. And I think that kind of flows into the copy that you're using in the product, the like how you're actually building those step-up flows, what you're using to trigger those step-up flows becomes a lot more important. And so when you're detecting, when you're building, trying to prevent fraud, like working, much more closely with the product team and trying to understand the trade-offs there, working closely with the designers to make sure you're kind of even more empathetic than you would be, because again, as you're trying to collect incremental signals, you do want to be thoughtful about how those flows are being surfaced if you are explicitly asking for information. And so for us, it's meant a lot more of going back into a product and looking at flows where we have step-up verification flows and thinking through, is the copy right? Like how do we soften the copy in the context of where the user lives. Language is not the same across the world, so I think that has become a lot more important for us outside of the systems design.
Um, I think that and Pratik hit on some points in terms of kind of like fitting it right to the right, what's the right thing to put there in terms of meeting expectations. I would hope that it's not we don't get to a place where we're saying it's a decision between privacy versus fraud, and but because the reality is that that's leading people to do kind of a one size fits all kind of experience, which I think means people overshare or information, and that's not a good thing. I think we need to, from a product perspective, it's forcing more context into what is the customer trying to do, and what is it that what's the intent versus what are the expectations on what we should be sharing and using to basically try to create this interaction. And because otherwise, what's happening is you start throwing up more and more different warnings, and I got to collect certain types of information in a certain way and do these much stronger authentication verification, and that just leads to people using more ambiguous signals, which creates this loop that we got to then do more activity. And I'd be surprised if we start to get some backlash from users who are just kind of getting tired of seeing, all of these different loops and hoops and steps where, that's not what they're looking for. They want security and privacy, but generally, it's been my experience that, they don't like that at the expense of convenience. They want to be able to get through the process.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Convenience, either security, both work here. And from security standpoint, I believe that uh, phrase privacy versus fraud prevention of security, this is a mostly false narrative. Why? Because there are, even though if we are not allowed to use, let's say, fingerprinting, is the customer uh, doesn't give us permission to do so. There are a lot of resources which we could use to gather information about his behavior, signals which we could collect on our own side. The customer, if he signed in, at least, couldn't prohibit us of using first-party signals. So we could still identify him. We could still rely on session data. We could still rely on TLS level fingerprints and detect different kinds of searches. We could still detect different kinds of platforms and operational systems. And that all, I don't think that that could be called privacy-related data, frankly speaking. What companies can't collect anymore, and that could impede the speed of decision making, is just the data which used to collect just in case. We would collect this, we would collect that, and later we would figure out how to utilize that. So I believe that the only significant product-related shift I saw is that privacy compliance started to mean being consequential in what data you collect and being aware of the purpose, why you collect it, and being explicit with your customers and users regarding its implications.
Thank you. Kind of heading to the next question and looking into the future, I think we've gone a long way without addressing those two magic letters that seem on everybody's lips. I think we've mentioned it maybe 2 or 3 times, but that's about it. How do you think privacy and fraud detection will change as AI agents start handling more online transactions?
I can start. I think that one of the things that here that really stands out to me is when you start to think about like agentic commerce and the concept that I have consumers or users that are coming to a site and they're presenting themselves to do something on the site, but it's not the human, and it has their information. And you talk about clicking the terms of service and doing that. It's not a human that's clicking the terms of service. It's an agent that's coming to the site. And you're talking about PII that has now been given over to an agent and now is traversing and going into the site as well, which could include very sensitive things like credentials and credit card information and other kind of things. These are going to present, I think, some real privacy challenges and for companies companies, kind of to your point earlier, we talked about like VPNs where people would just say, all VPN's bad, I'm going to kill it. But you can't say all agentic AI is bad, kill it. That is not a good strategy for the future. So this is something that good consumers are using and so are bad. But some of the tools that we relied on, like bot detection and other kind of capabilities like that, they're not going to have the same impact. You now have to really be able to determine, as Demetrius kind of talked about, what's bad, what's good. and make a determination, and then figure out how do you want to handle that data and that exchange in the world of compliance today.
Now, what's interesting here, the way how I see it is that payments itself is not changing on the issuer side, but the payments on the e-commerce side is changing drastically because the main markers which were used to identify fraudulent activity like speed, different strange type of activities on the web resources don't mean anything anymore because you're dealing with automated activity. So I believe the main issues here are not about privacy because it was the user's experience if we speak about legitimate use cases, just to share their PII with the program itself. All right, maybe it would be settled in different ways with additional consents, etc. And legally, it would be okay. But on the security, from the security standpoint, we can't actually say whether it is the payment methods which are being utilized, whether they compromised or not. And this is liability we need to focus more, not privacy itself, because privacy is the upstream question. And upstream question, if the user trusts the provider of that AI agent, or even though if the user owns that AI agent, this is absolutely another level of question. But when we speak about money flows, about liability shifts, this is where we need to focus on.
Yeah, great.
Yeah,
Good point there.
I
Pratik?
think I think for us, like we also being a payments payouts provider, looking at the payments layer, there's a lot changing. But at the same time, I think for some of the use cases, there are things that are ultimately the same, regardless of if it's an agent committing fraud or whether it's an individual. So I think looking across your stack and trying to identify points where behavior shouldn't change, methods don't shouldn't change, or rails don't change. I think those are kind of like choke points where you can look into and see if you can use that for fraud detection. So for us, you know, referral fraud, a bunch of money being diverted to a single account, money being funneled into a single bank account. That's still going to be the case regardless of whether it's 1,000 people sitting in a different country trying to get those referral rewards or whether it's 1,000 agents across the world. And so again, you're detecting fraud much later on because you have less signal. But I think trying to identify, well, like that funneling behavior doesn't change and using that to rethink how you may approach fraud, I think can be helpful.
Yeah, I think there was a really good point raised about liability as well, which is that as you're disintermediating and breaking the connection between the human and the action, who's going to take responsibility for a fraudster trying to use a service to attack someone? How do you build trust signals into AI agents so that you can tell the intent of the human that's instructing the agent by the time it gets out at the other end? And how do you ensure that agents are handling PII securely? Folks are just handing over their credentials and things like that to these agents. And what's to say that the agents are going to be handling that in a secure manner? Obviously, the largest ones are probably, have some skin in the game in terms of not wanting to get sued. Uh, but there are a lot of specialized agents that are coming out now that folks will want to use, particularly in their businesses. And how are those agents going to adapt and build in that trust as well? I know that we've got about 10 minutes left, and we've covered a broad range of topics, and we've already started to get some questions from our audience, including the one that's popping up on the screen right now. So if you have questions, you can enter them into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and we'll take those questions in just a moment. So again, you can enter those in. We'll take a look at those and be able to do that. But let's go to a question that we've already been asked, which is, given everything that we've talked about, what's one piece of practical advice that you have as we go into preparing for the upcoming year? I'll open that up to David first.
I was like, oh, that's a good question. I was like trying to, there's so many different things. I think, it's come up multiple times. And I think the first thing I would do is go back and make sure that you take an inventory to understand when it comes to these ambiguous signals that are coming in, can you see them? Are you able to see them as a company? And then make sure you have a way to look at your consumer basically persona to say how often or how normal is it for you to see this type of use, so that you can start to then take advantage of that in terms of understanding what looks good versus what looks bad. And that would be the number one first thing to do if you have not done that yet. And that applies to the current privacy regulations, as well as the emergence of agentic AI and other types of technologies. That's the first step.
Dimitri?
Yes, I was thinking about what to say here, what I would recommend to myself. And I believe my advice would be not trying to utilize the same methodology to solve different tasks. Where different tasks are, decrease friction, for example, or on the contrary, to detect multi-accounting, or to prevent different search of robotic activity on your device. Because it's all require different approaches and different technologies. And if you're trying to focus on a single one, you're shooting yourself to the foot. That's it.
Pratik?
I think my advice would be to spend the year just observing what's changing. I think there's this new world where obviously things have changed with AI and AI agents. Things will continue to evolve very quickly. And I think the best way to fight fraud is for us to understand what are the different vectors, what are the tools that other people are using. And so keeping an eye, keeping a pulse on on those tools, seeing how fraudsters are trying to defraud your systems or other people's systems. I think we are kind of in this, you can try and go out and be reactive, but I think there's also something to be said about just trying to understand what are the vectors you're trying to stop before we actually go down that path. So.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme that I've heard across all of you, which is really, as Stephen Covey said in his 7 Habits book, you really want to seek first to understand before you take action. So you can use the power of machine learning to understand your users. You really need to look into what differentiates a good returning user from a potential fraudster. And we want to keep the conversation going through things like these webinars, through industry meetups and things like that, where you want to keep in contact with your fellow CISOs, CIOs, product managers, fraud practitioners, to learn nuances from one another and share best practices. So for example, when you're looking at VPNs, when you're looking at residential proxies, there are ones where a lot of folks really are learning, oh, if you see this particular residential proxy provider, that's one that we know that fraudsters are more commonly using. Or we know the agents from the DPRK more commonly use this VPN. I know that there are AI agents out there like Fraud GPT that the fraudsters are using. So it requires a lot of nuance and really digging into that profile further to be able to better understand these things. Kind of looking at Q&A. Let's see, we've got another question, which is, we're not using AI yet. We feel like we have a pretty good fraud solution. How important is it really to be looking at AI today in building our fraud stack? David, I think that's one that was specifically aimed at you as well.
Yeah, so the first part of it is like right now, the first thing I would do is just like, can you tell? To ask your team, can you tell if this is agentic AI, agentic commerce that's occurring? Can you actually see it, right? How do you tell when a transaction is occurring? Because that's the first kind of step. Then you can go to the second level question of now, what do you want to do about it, and what do you need to go check and change, and how do I say if it's good or if it's bad? Users are using this right now, and if you're familiar with some of the kind of the early technology concepts like Theory X, like you have early adopters that are definitely using it in certain issues like travel and others, where it's a great way to go shop and find something and it'll go buy. And you do want to make sure that you can take advantage of those early adopters, early movers that are coming in. That doesn't mean every industry is probably going to be wanting to go into this. So, it really does depend on what industry you're in as to how important it is that you start to think about, how I want to deal with agentic commerce.
Yeah. Here's another question. Ooh, this one's actually for me. How can Fingerprint help us to separate risky device behavior from normal shared device situations so that we don't overblock? So we actually have a dashboard in our solution that allows you to see behavior, what the characteristics are of your user base in general. So like, again, what percentage are using VPNs, what percentage are using residential proxies and so forth. And then we have a beta program right now where you can actually upload labeled data on your fraudulent devices, and we can help you to weight what we call our suspect score to be able to make it so that you can customize it so that we can say, hey, these are the things your fraudulent devices have in common. These are the things your non-fraudulent devices have in common. So here's how you can change your fraud rules around that. I imagine that some of those are also present in you guys' solutions as well. Excellent. All right. So looks like we are almost out of time. So I am going to wrap it up here. Definitely had a lot of great questions. Anything that we didn't get to today, we will make sure to reach out to you via email and be able to answer those. If you are interested in learning more, we have a State of AI Fraud and Privacy report that was the source for some of the statistics that we talked about today. And so you can just scan that QR code or go directly to fingerprint.com if you are wary of QR codes. Although let me assure you, this does not do something terrible to your phone like, have never going to give you up or something on there. And no Rickrolling here. But again, you can learn more about that. And I'd really like to thank our panelists for their participation. I know I learned a lot today. I was taking a ton of notes as we did that I'm definitely going to follow up with you guys after the webinar about. And I hope that you all learned something as